If you watch a station that's got a liberal slant to it, you should watch a conservative station, because then you know where the conversations are. And I'm talking about reading or watching without screaming at the TV, just like listening to what people say and to have conversation. Because until you have these conversations, things aren't going to change, and you're not going to find a middle road where you can all get along.
That's longtime New York TV news anchor Kristen Shaughnessy, still looking for good stories. And I'm John Lee.
And I'm Martin Nutty, and welcome to another global Irish conversation on Irish Stew.
This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by the Irish Heritage Tree Program. Celebrate your Irish roots by planting native trees for family and friends in the beautiful Golden Vale of Ireland. Go to irishheritagetree.com and use the exclusive discount code today. It's IrishStew10 for 10% off. That code again is IrishStew and the numeral 10. Keep the heritage of Ireland green and growing by going to irishheritagetree.com.
Hi, everybody. This is Martin Nutty with the Irish Stew podcast, broadcasting from New York City. And I'd like to welcome my co-host, John Lee. John, how are you, man?
Thank you, Martin. Good to be back, and great to have a very familiar face in New York journalism, an award-winning TV journalist, a wife, a mom, a TED talker, a two-time Irish Business Organization of New York speaker, and now the culmination of her illustrious career, a guest spot on Irish Stew. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I'm excited to join you.
You see, your background's in journalism, mine's in PR, so I put the extra hype spin there at the end.
I enjoy that. I think I need you to come around with me all the time.
Absolutely, I'll be your hype man. We're talking to you at 8 a.m. in the morning, which for Martin and I is a shade early.
I would have made it later.
No, that's great. No, it works for us because we're both working stiffs on top of doing Irish Stew. But 8 a.m. in the morning would have been kind of a midday for you earlier in your career.
Yeah, we were probably on lunch right about now. So got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, 1:50 really, for many of those days for almost 26 years. So a long time, hard habit to break. So I was up at 4 this morning.
I've done a lot of work with TV news in my role at the New York Racing Association, and I was often on the job of the morning remotes for the morning news, the weather remote or the sports remote, and I'd be getting there at 4 a.m. So,
did you like it or no?
I liked it once I got there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was, and also it was not my normal thing. Although for like maybe a week at a time, I'd be out there every day at 4 a.m. with a cup of coffee, setting up the microwave truck and that type of thing.
Funny that you just mentioned coffee. A lot of people who work really early in the morning, like the 4 and 5 a.m.s, they'll drink coffee, but 2 and 3 a.m.s often don't drink coffee. I don't drink coffee. Isn't that funny?
Really?
I don't know what that is, but
I can't imagine navigating that kind of day. Well, Kristen, we mentioned your. We're going to dig in a lot on the whole journalism question, your experience in journalism in general. But let's find out more about the Kristen Shaughnessy Irish American, and Martin's our resident expert on things genealogical. So you'll probably find out you're both closely related.
I know. I was like, maybe Martin can help us here. We had a cousin who did our genealogy in the 90s, like the early 90s. And he found out, it dates back to like just around the famine. It looks like that's when our family came over. They settled mostly in Northampton, Massachusetts. But there were a number who there was one great-great-grandfather who lived to 87 from, the 1850s to 1937. And I'm like, that's an incredible lifespan for that time period, right? To go through what he went through and to be born in Ireland, it was very fascinating. So, and then at that point, we used to have the O in front of our name, and then drop the O. We used to have the extra E, and somewhere along the line, ours was dropped. I think, I don't think there's a lot of Shaughnessy's left. Martin can tell me if they are. But
yeah, it's a name that's actually concentrated in Ireland over on the West Coast.
Yes.
More interestingly, in kind of Galway and Clare, although there are other pockets.
Exactly.
And there's a website you can actually go into to plug your name into it. Given my quite unique name, it barely registers.
Oh, really? Yeah.
But in your case, yeah, you can see this clustering around Galway and Clare around, the early 1900s thereabouts.
Yeah.
And you're correct. It's not a hugely common name in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
My background is I came to America as a track and field athlete on athletic scholarship.
Okay.
And maybe a decade before me, there was actually a very famous runner called Niall O'Shaughnessy, mm-hmm. who went to Arkansas. And if you know anything about sports in America or college sports, track and field in Arkansas became a dynasty. And he was actually the founding Irish member of that dynasty.
Is that right?
So, yeah, absolutely.
My dad was a track and field coach, so I'll have to relay all this information. He'll find that fascinating.
Yeah. Sadly, Niall passed away about 4 or 5 years ago, unfortunately, from the Big C.
Yeah.
But a lovely guy by all accounts, although we never actually crossed paths. I did meet his coach, who is another legend. If you ever go down to Arkansas, you will find a massive track and field facility as a result of these two Irishmen.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'm going to have to tell my dad because he will be very interested in that. And you had mentioned Galway, and that's where our lineage goes to. And it's Lauren Shaughnessy and a Mary Murphy met. So Mary Murphy Shaughnessy, and then from there were Burkes involved, and they also said that there was like a large. We go back when they talked about like the forfeiture of land that our family had to give up at one point. I won't get into the whole history, but then they also said that in Galway, because they lost their land, so they didn't have money, but their name held, like, I guess they were known as solid people. So they said you wouldn't be able to find a jury in Galway that would convict a Shaughnessy. So I was like, oh, that's good to know. So that was like a little bit of family lore that he found. So.
Yeah, well, I guess if they encountered your American descendants, maybe the attitude has shifted a little bit over the generations.
Yes, yeah.
But let me ask you this. Talk a little bit about your Irish background, but I believe you grew up in, is it Pine Bush up in Orange County, north of the city?
I did, yeah. It's about 80 miles north of the city, and it's a very small, well, it's grown since then, but it was a one-stoplight town. I had a party line for a phone, so we shared with 5 families or maybe more, I don't know. So I didn't have a television growing up. We were encouraged to read and listen to the radio. So it was a different kind of upbringing. And then we'd come into the city, obviously, for more culture.
Kristen, I just want to clarify, because we have listeners all over the world and different age groups. Let's explain to these folks what a party line is.
A party line is a line that you don't just have with your family. So there would be 5 or more families who had the same line. So I don't know, it was a time when phones were on the wall and you had to hit the button there to get a dial tone. And one of the families had 3 girls as well. So when we were teenagers, you would like fight for that, to hit that button. Otherwise, you would never get the phone for hours. So it was just a shared line. And I remember when we were dating, my husband, Joe, and I, this woman came in line. She said, "Can I just use the phone for a minute?" And he said, "What is going on?" I said, "Just hang up. I'll call you back." So that is a party line. It's not always a party, but it's a shared phone line.
so not on the cutting edge of technology.
No, not at all.
Speaking of primitive telecommunications, besides your phone situation, I noticed you just slid into the conversation, and I have read this, that you grew up in a household essentially without a TV, which is pretty interesting given how your career evolved and the business you got into. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I knew my parents really wanted us to read and form our own opinions. And particularly during the Vietnam War, that was sort of when they made their decisions. So they didn't want people forming our opinions for us. And today, in this age of opinion journalism, right? Like everybody seems to be giving their opinion as opposed to true journalists who just stay middle of the road and let people figure out how they feel about an issue, which I think is what journalism should be. That's what they wanted us to do. So I was like 12, I think, when I decided I wanted to be a reporter. It was also something that just really wasn't available to me in Pine Bush. And it was sort of seemed like a very difficult path to take. So I was kind of up for the challenge. I didn't know anybody who was a TV or reporter at all. So, I mean, I went to Hofstra University, which was great because from freshman year on, you could produce a show if you wanted to. You could direct a show. It was very hands-on from the beginning. And I needed that because I didn't know a thing about television. I remember my first television class. It blew my mind because I never watched TV again the same way. Because once you know how it's made, you look at it completely differently. So
it's interesting because you make a decision to become a reporter, but you're not watching TV. So who is your media model that you were looking at? Were you listening to radio during that time? Or, how do you make the big leap from not watching TV to wanting to be on TV?
Well, it wasn't necessarily TV. It was reporting. But then, it became TV. I started in radio. It was just, I devoured a lot of newspapers growing up. My relatives were in a different part of the state. So I would read the newspaper when I went there, their newspaper. I loved facts and trying to figure out a situation and reading different opinions of a situation. So that always intrigued me. And then it was just, I think just reading and wanting to be able to present that to people without telling them how to feel, that was very intriguing to me. And I think I read a lot as a kid. So there was that as well.
And writing is such a key, and maybe the radio kind of background is even more, the writing becomes even more important. Kristen, I've worked with a lot of young reporters in a couple of different markets, not just New York, but also up in Albany area when the racing moved to Saratoga. So
right.
I was seeing a lot of reporters in the early stages of their career. And what are some of the challenges, both learning the craft and, navigating the low paid remote work that you're kind of forced to do earlier in your career?
Just laying out all the glamour there, I see, John.
Right. I worked at a radio station, WGNY. Still, I actually just visited with the owner not too long ago. He gave me a shot, which was good because at the time I sounded like Mickey Mouse on the air, or Minnie Mouse, whatever it was, and not a good radio voice at all. And I thought I could write well because writing was really stressed in my classes at Hofstra, which was great. Because writing for radio, you have to paint a picture. So you can't rely on video. So it really hones those skills. And there were really good people who wrote there. But I made $5 an hour. There was a lot of overtime, but there was no overtime pay. So it was $40 a day. So I went to bartending school as well. And I became a bartender. And they happened to be a mile down the road from each other. So I would change from one set of clothing to the other. And I would basically just work from like 8 or 9 in the morning till like sometimes 2 or 3 in the morning. And I did that for like a year and a half while maintaining my husband. My now husband was in New Jersey. So we'd commute. We had a commuting relationship. It's what you do when you're young, right? It's like when you're young and you have a dream and that's what you do. So
my first job out of college was working in an art museum, and I was actually an art history major. So I was in Washington, D.C., and I had a kind of part-time job. Not a lot of jobs for art history majors, but I found one part-time job at the National Gallery of Art. But in the evenings, I worked at a liquor store, and I was amazed with the crossover of the clientele in both places.
Exactly,
I was seeing a lot of the same faces.
Yeah. And you learn a lot about people skills, right? So
I'll name drop another somebody we'd love to get on Irish Stew someday is Roger Clark. Did you cross paths with him in that phase of your life? Early on?
Here's a fun fact about Roger. Yeah. Roger and I have we've worked at the same stations throughout our career, never at the same time until he came to New York. So great guy. And great storyteller.
I'll just mention Roger is I call him New York's best friend.
Yeah,
he's just a kind of the regular guy that people relate to, who's just out on doing any kind of crazy stuff, doing serious stuff as well. So
and he's a reservoir of knowledge. Like, he knows facts. He's such a smart guy, and he just has this. He studies things, and he just, he'll give you fun facts that you wouldn't know about a particular thing. So he could take the most mundane issue or mundane story and make it really interesting. So,
well, enough about Roger. We'll get to him on another day. But Kristen, what are some of the crazy things happen in TV journalism? What are some of the fun stories, the unexpected stories that you've worked on?
Oh, I mean, well, there's interesting stories, which we can get into. And then there's crazy stories. There was one time when I was doing a live shot, and I heard what sounded like gunshots behind me. It wasn't. It was somebody cracking. When you're live, you're kind of tuned into that. It was somebody who was like cracking eggs, but like making it seem they were targeting journalists. And then he went back and he made a whole video about it, and it's on air, about how he was going to disrupt my live shot. Like, he had plotted it from his house, which is a little scary when you think about somebody kind of tracking your moves or whatever. But it was funny at the, in the time. It wasn't a story he should have been doing that on, because it was a serious story. We've had situations where, like, I was outside MSG doing a live shot, and a man just was having an episode and completely like strips down. We had to call the cops, like, it was just, but I'm live, and they're like, "Can you go live?" I'm like, "Sure," but all this is going on to the side of you. So it's almost never what's right in front of you. It's always, on the either side, that there could just be the strangest things happening, and you have to just focus and tell the story.
So, Kristen, I just want to fill in the blanks.
Sure.
You said you started off in the radio business. So talk to me a little bit about the leap from radio to TV. Was that straight to New York One? Was there anything else in between?
Yeah, there was a station in Wappingers Falls, Poughkeepsie area, that I did for a couple of years. They actually, they had a nightly newscast. So I went from the bartending and radio, a lot of hours. And then this was basically probably the only 9 to 5, technically. I mean, it was like 9 to 7, but it was a job I had. They had a live newscast at 5:30, I think we had every night. It was half hour. And during the day, you were required to do a story and maybe a couple other stories, put it all together. But like at 6 o'clock, people walked out the door, and I was like, "What is happening?" It's the only time that happened, but it was interesting. And it was a good, that was a good way to get into television. I was hired as a reporter. Then the longtime anchor had left. Everybody thought she'd be there forever. And she was such a good role model for me. She was great at her craft, and she just unexpectedly left. So they let me fill in, telling me it was temporary, because clearly I wasn't ready for it. But then it became a permanent thing. So until I went to New York One. So it was a good way to ease into anchoring and TV reporting and sort of learn. There's different terms that you use in radio compared to TV. So it was a good in-between station for me.
Did that Wappinger Falls job, and just to explain to listeners that are not familiar with New York State geography, again, Wappingers Falls is north of New York State. But my question is there was an infamous story in that part of the world, the Tawana Brawley story. Did that line up with that timeline? Was it before? Was it beyond?
It did. I was actually interning at WNBC when that happened, the summer that happened. So I would go up there a lot with the crews, and we would cover that. And I had actually heard, that it was basically a hoax at the time, long before it came out in the public. But there was a lot involved, because there were a lot of local players involved in that, accused and whatnot. And a lot of lives changed because of that one.
Yeah, it's almost like, just to explain to listeners, it's almost like an interesting test case, if you will, in kind of writing or, getting a story out. A highly charged story, accusations of rape directed against, governmental officials. I believe there was a police officer involved. Al Sharpton, who becomes a major player in New York City and New York State politics, to some degree makes his reputation in the course of this, and it ultimately turns out to be a hoax. And it takes a while for that to happen. And so, the issues of, people's reputations being damaged, etc., because of the sensational accusations. Did you have any take about that at that point in time, from a journalistic perspective, what was done, what wasn't done?
I think it goes to show you how important it is to get the facts and not like you have to get your own facts. You have to build your own sources, and you can't, you have to verify, right? Trust, but verify, because if not, as you said, lives can be destroyed. And if it were true, that would also be as awful, right? So there were going to be no winners in this. There was going to be on either side. But the way that this all played out, and then it casts credibility issues and whatnot. So it's something you just have to be really careful about as a journalist, because you want people to be able to trust what you're telling them is true. So, and in this case, it's hard because it's kind of a he said, she said type thing. So that becomes murkier.
It kind of whole presages the Me Too era that we're into at this point in time, but not in let's say it may have set things back a long way by virtue of the fact that this turned out to be a hoax case. But just kind of moving you forward from Wappingers Falls towards New York One, just to explain to listeners, New York One is a channel that was obviously offered specifically New York City in the metro area. Now, if you're in Ireland, there's only 6 million people in Ireland, but the New York metro area has 20 million people. So it's had a substantial footprint. And it was unusual in the sense that it was carried, I guess, on cable rather than on broadcast. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. It was designed as sort of not a gift to the city, but sort of like it was designed to inform the people of New York City, not necessarily as a profit-making TV station originally. It was an idea that was conceived of 3 men who had worked at CBS together, and they were given a lot of resources by Time Warner to kind of create the state-of-the-art news station. And so they brought, a lot of ideas that are now used today. They were the first ones to introduce them. And at the time, there was a lot of pushback because change can always be a little bit scary to people, and a lot of that has stuck, what they introduced. And it was sort of, we don't care what the reporters look like. There wasn't the emphasis on hair and makeup. It was more on the substance. And are you a good journalist? And can you report the facts? And can you tell the neighborhood story? Because in New York City, there are so many neighborhoods and so many nationalities. And so there's, hundreds of stories in every neighborhood to tell, let alone an entire city. So it was sort of take those smaller stories and then weave those together and then also tell the bigger city story, in addition to how that plays in state and national politics.
And I think the analogy people might understand is sort of a CNN for New York City.
Exactly.
It was that kind of news cycle with features that you could rely on when they would show up, and continuing reporting. I mean, and there were a couple of times I tried to get some story from my PR role that was, 5 miles outside of New York City. Like, no,
nope.
Not interested. It's New York City exclusively. Yeah. And actually for Belmont Park, I had to show probably Roger Clark. I had to show him a map that showed that the New York City line cut through a corner of Belmont Park. So we were technically in New York City. Well, Kristen, let's talk about I'm interested in the experience of being an anchor. What's going through your head? What kind of frame of mind are you in before that red light goes on the camera and you're on?
I think it's, once you do it for a long time, it just becomes very normal, right? So I almost have to think back 30 years to like what it was like in the beginning. And then it's, wow, you're walking on a set and it's like what you saw on TV that you watched as a kid. But then it just sort of becomes very normal. And they always teach you, when you're anchoring, just treat the camera like your friend, because you're going into people's living rooms and you want to tell a story. You don't want to, just kind of be barking the news at someone. And you have to learn to develop your own style. We did that segment called In the Papers, which I really enjoyed, where we would take, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, New York Post, the Daily News, and others, and talk about the different stories that we read through. We would read those in between anchoring and pick out the stories that we found interesting. And then it would be like a 9-minute ad lib. And that was fun because you could add some flavor to it. So, and point out different things.
Well, the local news scene, like every aspect of news, has changed so much. It's such a multiverse of news options.
Mm-hmm.
Local news getting kind of lost in the shuffle in a lot of ways? It just doesn't seem as vibrant, or is it popping up in other ways that we're only just starting to learn about?
Well, I think if you look at I have a daughter in college and one who's out of college, and they don't watch news on television. And I don't know if they ever have. That's not how they grew up. They grew up with screens, and they get the news is so immediate now between all the different options that you have between Twitter and, just alerts from, different stations or whatever, that you don't really need to sit down and watch a newscast necessarily to get all your news. The immediacy is so different. And, local news budgets have been chopped tremendously. You hear of all these newspapers folding, and, all news is local, right? So all news starts. I used to cover, as you know, like upstate, I used to cover small local, I'd cover town board meetings, I'd cover city council meetings, but smaller cities like Newburgh, and very relevant issues. And then you realize how that's like the microcosm of the macrocosm. So it's so important that we have local news. And I don't really know. I think we'll probably see that come back a little bit again, because otherwise, how do you hold people accountable? And that's really the job of local news. And if you don't have people holding people accountable, you're going to have chaos. So I remember covering politicians who, I think they started out essentially good and for the right reasons, and they would run for, like, say, a town board or whatever. And they would get corrupted by the process because they couldn't get anything done unless they played the game. And a lot of them were willing to play the game instead of fighting against the system that was in place and calling it out. So, I think for that reason, local news is very important. I think you do have a lot of independent journalists who are doing that work, but just in different ways. And you have to find out who you trust and who you believe, and then follow them, to report.
There's a lot of, I know in my area, a lot of hyper local websites that do a good job covering a lot of fun stuff. This restaurant opened, this school is having but then again, you don't really know their journalistic standards. You don't know what they're answering to as opposed to an established news source.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, if you follow someone for a little while and then you realize, like, if they start turning story after story, that's good. Then you say, okay, this is a person I can trust. Sometimes people put like broad brushes on, say, like a specific newspaper or something, say, oh, I can't read that newspaper. Well, there's good reporters within that newspaper. So find the good reporters. If you don't paint everything with a broad brush, and then I think that's helpful because there's a lot of good journalists out there, young, old, in between. You just kind of have to find who's telling you the facts and not telling you how to think.
Speaking of, let's say, flagship journalists, just in the news over here, Steve Wallace, when I say over here in America.
Chris Wallace, yeah.
Chris Wallace.
Yeah.
Chris Wallace.
Yeah.
Right? Just left Fox News to join CNN.
I know. I saw that I was sad about that, because I like his show a lot.
Yeah. And it seemed to me, let's say for more moderately aligned people, that he was the voice of reason within the Fox News world. So I wonder, do you have any thoughts on that or observations? You said you were disappointed to see him moving. So,
well, you know what? I think he has tough questions, and it doesn't matter who he's asking them of. It doesn't matter what party he's interviewing. He just asks the questions that people at home want answered. They're like, "Why is this so?" And he demands the answer, and he goes back. If they don't answer it, he hits again, but he does it in a very fair way, I think. And you don't really know where he stands on issues, which I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's rare now. Everybody thinks everybody wants their opinion. I'm like, I don't care what your opinion is. Everybody has one. Just tell me the facts.
You touched on this a couple of times, and I've really think about it a lot is, I'm looking at the kind of the CNN, MSNBC type news sources, and there's a lot of folks that really start off, they seem like great reporters.
Mm-hmm.
They're really out there in the field. They're getting the work done. They're coming back with great sound bites and interviews. And increasingly, they're turning into commentators.
Right.
And they become less good because sort of like, well, I don't really care in a way. I liked it when you were telling me what was really going on. But I guess the root is to be a talking head commentator.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like it's changed to that. I don't think it has to be that. And I don't think people at home necessarily want that. Some do. But, I think what makes the country more divided than it has been in a long time is you have people on either side not listening, right? Like I always say, if you read one newspaper that's conservative, you should read another paper that isn't. Likewise, if you watch a station that's got a liberal, slant to it, you should watch a conservative station because then you know where the conversations are. And I'm talking about reading or watching without screaming at the TV, just like listening to what people say and to have conversation. Because until you have these conversations, things aren't going to change, and you're not going to find a middle road where you can all kind of get along, so to speak. You don't have to agree, but you can get along, and you don't have to be so, the venom that is spewed now is just sort of out of control at times.
Yes, I'm thinking, the word outrage journalism kind of jumps to mind, and sensationalism, like in the local news space, there used to be the old saw, live at 6, dead at 9, buried at 11, kind of like, if it bleeds, it leads. And one of the things that I did admire about New York One was that didn't seem to be kind of, what New York One was leading with. It wasn't, okay, let me get a shot of pavement with a blood stain on it.
No, that was sort of frowned upon, unless, it was more the story behind the story. If there was a shooting, it was like, okay, well, let's explore how this has happened in this neighborhood. What are the core issues? You would get into the meat and potatoes of it, as opposed to, just the sensational part of it. And what you'd find are probably a lot of concerned families who are dealing with gun violence in their neighborhood. And then you go and talk to them. And then, from there, you can have more conversation. But if you just do the aftermath of the emotion, it's not really going to solve anything. So it definitely was not, if it bleeds, it leads, because that sort of was the mantra for a lot of stations at that time. And that was completely not expected or appreciated at New York One.
Kristen, you talk about emotions in a story. I think a signature moment for anyone involved with journalism in New York was 9/11. Mm-hmm. I was really kind of in awe of the job that local news did around 9/11. I mean, it was near heroic. I've never seen better work out of reporters at that time. And I know this is a story you were intimately involved with. Can you take us back to that point and maybe reflect back on that?
Sure. It was primary day in the city. So I was working the early morning shift, but a lot of people were working night because that was when Mayor Bloomberg was running. He was in the primary. And at that point, people weren't sure how he would do. And obviously, the course changed over the next couple of weeks after September 11th. We got a call. We were at a Brooklyn school. We got a call that from our desk, we had just rolled a lot of cable through a school to the end of the school. So if anybody knows TV, like you're taking the cable off a live truck and you're running it all the way through, and there were only 2 of us. And so we thought they were kidding because they knew how extensive that job was. And then it quickly became apparent that they weren't. We rolled up the cable, we jumped into the live truck, and then the streets of Brooklyn were already crowded. And people were asking us what happened, and we were listening to the radio, and that's when the second plane hit. And we looked at each other and we just said, it's terrorism. Like at that point, you knew. You had an idea that might be what it is, or just you thought maybe it was a plane just gone awry. But then it was obvious. And so we went over the Manhattan Bridge. The Manhattan Bridge had been closed off, but there were cops there and there was a fire truck. There's a station nearby, and they were going over and they said, follow us. So it was literally our live truck following the fire truck into Manhattan. We got to right about City Hall, and then they went to the World Trade Center, and we couldn't get through because the mass, the crowds of people were so great. So we parked just across from City Hall. And then I ran to the towers, and I went up to they had the command center right in the front there. And I wanted to go into the building because I saw the firefighters going up into the building, and they're like, you can't go into the building. And there was a look, a lot of the FDNY officials that we lost that day, they're always so in command, and they were still in command. I don't mean to say that they weren't, but there was a look of like concern that you don't usually see. And I mean, why? Because I think they probably knew what they were dealing with, much faster than anybody else. And so they told me at one point, they're like, you got to get back and you got to get away from here. And at that point, there was nothing really around. People were either in the building or they had gotten away almost, I think there were people on the West Side Highway that was crowded and whatnot. But, people were making desperate decisions at the time, and just stuff that, decisions people should never have to be forced to make in their lives, they were making, and it was happening. So I just ran to a payphone that was sort of nearby so I could still keep my eye on what was going on. And then as I was doing a live report, that first tower came down, and it just sounded like a pancake, like just like it came down like a pancake, but the sound, in your head, you can still hear that sound. And then like this roar because of all the debris. And there was an FBI agent near me, and he started running. Because if he wasn't running, I was like, I was going to hang on, but I'm like, he's running. So we ran together, and then we kind of caught up with the masses. So
now you're just dealing, you're way off script now.
I know.
There's no precedent, there's no precedent for what you're doing. There's no, how do you do this? Nobody's ever done it. So how'd you do it?
I always tell this story, but I thought nobody understood how bad it was down there because they couldn't see what I was saying. First of all, it was a time of, I had a beeper. I don't know if I had a cell phone or like those flip phones, like that.
Right.
And everything was out because the antennas were up on the World Trade. So you couldn't get through. The payphone was my only option. Like there was no communication. I hadn't met up with they said they were going to send a shooter to meet me, a photographer. So I hadn't met up with anybody. So it was just me. And I'm like, I just got to tell the story so people know what it's like down here. But you're also in your head saying, how bad do you tell people it is? Because if you have family in there, because my brother was across the street, like you don't want to tell everything you're seeing because you're just going to panic people. But you're a journalist, so you have to tell the facts. Yeah. So it was that, just say it's pretty bad down here. Say what you're seeing. I just saw Father Michael Judge just before that. And then afterward, I ran into two retired firefighters after we ran to the east side. And they said, Father Judge died. And I was like, it was so heartbreaking, but it was so unreal because I'm like, I just saw him, and so that's when you realize. And then they were talking about how they dug themselves out of like 2 floors of debris and they were covered. So it was just sort of on the fly. I called back and said, I'm okay, but it was sort of a frantic phone call. I don't really remember what I said in that. And then I just calmed myself down and then you just get to work, and we worked straight through, and I don't think we took a day off I think my first day off was like, I don't know, a long, long time. We didn't have a commercial, I think, for 14 days.
Wow.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that was 14 days. So that was a decision by the city. It was just to be a vehicle for New Yorkers. And one of my colleagues, Andrew Kurtzman, he was told to find the mayor. In fact, I did a series on the 15 year that I put on my Instagram, those, I don't know, where you can save stories like underneath your name, this 6-part series talking to my colleagues about how they remember the story and did it. Because we didn't really talk about that. We just got to work. And so it was really interesting to hear their recollections of that day. And I did 2 parts with Andrew, and he was basically told, find the mayor. Well, how do you find the mayor? It's near, how do you do that? And he got dropped off by a cab driver who he convinced to drive him down close to the scene. And all of a sudden, the mayor and the police commissioner, Bernie Carrick, they pop out of this building like a metal door. and he said, "Andrew, follow me." And so he took the New York One mic and he was broadcasting to I think it went in other countries. I think our newsfeed went in other countries at the time. And he sort of became the voice for the country at that time because everything was sort of centered on New York. I remember people saying that, so much was happening in Washington and they felt it was so overshadowed by what was happening in New York, but there was major events happening in both places, probably the biggest story of both places. And it was just that.
And that'd be Mayor Giuliani.
Yes.
At that time, Rudy Giuliani. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of clearly that attack and the journalism that surrounded it was a frantic few weeks where there was barely a moment to stop and reflect. Can you talk a little bit about the point where all of a sudden you step back? You've seen some pretty traumatic things. Some people may not be able to function after that. So fine, you're working on adrenaline,
right?
You're getting it done, but eventually you kind of have to look back. Like you talked about the sound of the collapsing building is something that's imprinted on you. But I think there's probably a lot of other things imprinted.
Oh, I mean, you could go back to that moment like it was yesterday. Sometimes it feels like, and then sometimes it feels so long ago. But I think what I took out of it was how grateful I was just to be one of the luckier ones that day, right? I covered the fire department after that. So we were covering a lot of the widows who, some had children, some didn't, parents grieving, widows grieving. It was just, and entire fire companies were grieving. So you'd go to these fire houses and, some lost almost everyone. And so it really gives you perspective. And so it becomes so not about you and what you dealt with. Like you're just sort of a very small piece of a very big story. And your job was to tell the story. So I think that gave me just gratitude for what happened, for what I experienced. And I'm glad that I was the one who could tell the story, because I think I tried to do it in a very even-handed way. And just like, you try not to alarm people, but you have to give them the facts as well. And the facts sometimes were just alarming, just in and of themselves. But there were a lot of rumors at the time. I mean, I was hearing when I was down there, and again, no communication, right? So I'm hearing the Liberty Bell got hit. I'm hearing this airport got bombed. I mean, all sorts of stories. And I'm like, I'm not going with any of that but if you had maybe a less experienced journalist, maybe they would have gone with it just because they were hearing it. So it was one of those. I'm grateful for me that it ended the way it did, but you're sad for all the other families, and you realize the impact. And September 11th, you always I know a lot of the families don't even go near the television, and I don't blame them. I think everybody has their own way of dealing with grief, and for some, it's very, very comforting. So everybody kind of finds their own way.
Yeah. Kristen, let's move the conversation to another story you've been deeply involved in that you wish you hadn't been deeply involved in. I'm sure you were part of a group of talented professional journalists, women at New York One, who increasingly found themselves on the outside looking in, resulting in your departure from New York One. There was a time of a lawsuit and an uncomfortable time of working through a lawsuit. The lawsuit ended in a confidential resolution, so I imagine there's not a lot you can say about that specifically.
Yeah, I prefer not to talk about any of that. I can talk about issues generally, though. I won't talk about my time at New York One during that period, but there are issues that impact so many industries that are important and worth exploring.
Let's get into it that way, because I know I read a piece of yours on the Medium about needing a plan B in life, and your TED Talk about essentially ageism and ageism that's more heightened around women. So let's get into that topic. What are you seeing in the world troubling, and are there some trends to set this thing in the right direction in terms of age discrimination in the workplace?
Yeah. And I want to stress, I'm just talking generally and not my experience, but ageism, I think it impacts so many industries, and it, in some industries, it's more obvious than other industries, but it happens, and it's happening to men and women. And I think people are surprised when it happens to them. We have spoken to people actually all over the world, and all of a sudden they start feeling maybe alienated, or reviews aren't necessarily what they were, but they feel like their job performance hasn't changed. If not, maybe it's even gotten stronger. So they're not quite sure what that is. And, I was talking to one woman, a senior executive in a well-known tech company, and she went to her human resources and said, what's happening here? And now she's negotiating her departure because she spoke up. So people have to just be aware, that when I think an employee faces issues like ageism, it's very hard to identify what it is at first, because I think a person's, from all these people that we've spoken to in all sorts of industries, they always think it's them, right? So it's sort of like, what am I? It's sort of, the process is designed to make you lose confidence in yourself and to question yourself and to feel alienated. So, and they all talk about, I just thought it was me. So you have a decision, they have to figure out if they're going to bring it to someone's attention. And this woman did. And now this is a company she had loved working for. Her father had worked for this company. I mean, it was really in her family, and it was her pride. But she just realized that she was being left out of meetings and all those things. So I always say, when talking to these people, well, look at the top of your company and see what that looks like, right? Because if there aren't different lived experiences and there aren't different voices and religions and genders, there's very insular conversations that are happening that don't have a worldview necessarily. I remember when my daughter went to college, she said, I need to go to a school where it looks like the world I live in, right? Like it needs to be diverse because you need to have all those experiences. And I think that sort of is here. And, with ageism and the issues that people face it goes to marketing, right? Like you see commercials and like everybody over 50 is like complaining about something. It's like, it's like, it could be the best time of your life, but you wouldn't know it from the marketing. And when they looked at the marketing, they found a lot of the marketing is done by younger people, right? So there's that that's happening. And there's just, in the tech industry, it's particularly bad. I should have brought the statistics, but it's like, I think it's like 30 is considered old in some of those industries.
Oh, absolutely.
And 40 is the number. 40 is the number where federal laws come into place to protect you. And 40 sounds young, but
yeah,
I've talked to a number of people in their 40s and they're feeling it. So I think my advice would be to document. I think people have to document and just kind of be aware. And also, I don't think this ageism should be an issue that everybody talks about, because it's the one thing, we all get older. There's nothing you can do about it, right? So like everybody gets older. So this should be an issue that concerns everybody, because even if you're comfortable in your 20s, what happens when you're 40 and 50? So, it's the reasons for speaking out are for everyone eventually.
So I don't think we can really talk, ageism is certainly part of what's at play, but also there is let's say in the media world, there is certainly a different tier if you're a man or a woman, it seems to me. For example, a lot of broadcasts that I see, there may be, a dual anchor on, or, a broadcast that features both men and women. Generally speaking, I would say that the women on those broadcasts are significantly younger than the men. So it just seems kind of a little more extreme. But the question I was kind of leading into is, how do we stop? How do we step back from the brink of this madness? And what I'm thinking of is, you'll hear people saying, well, that's the demographic we want to be in, the 18 to 32. Right. It's like nobody else counts. And last time I checked, people that were between 18 and 32 don't actually have any frickin' money to buy the stuff they're advertising.
Where is the buying power, right? Yeah.
So it's almost like a mantra that is repeated mindlessly. Mm-hmm. And where does wisdom fit into this thing? Okay, I don't look 18 to 32 anymore, but guess what? I have a life of experience, and some of the best experiences I've had are talking to people, and still are talking to people that are a good deal older than me.
Right.
To be able to tap into that. So how do we step away from this kind of toxic youth obsession?
Right. And I think I think you've hit it on the head. I think in the media industry, just generally speaking, again, but it's very visible, right? So people can see, but if you go to any industry, you're going to see this happening. You're going to see that oftentimes the top everybody looks very similar, right? And this isn't a lot of times it's white men at the top. And that's not bashing white men at all, because we need white men too. Like there's nothing, but there needs to be different conversations and more people allowed in the inner circle, right? But also when you have people in power, they want to keep power. So it's you say, how do you break it? I don't know. You have to have some people who are willing to have conversations. You have to have, if women see men who are being forced out, women should speak up too, just like they should speak up for other women. If you see something going on, you should be willing to speak up. And I think, when we have spoken to women and men, they feel very alienated because people are concerned. They're more concerned about their own comfort than they are necessarily about doing the right thing. Doing the right thing is sometimes the hard thing. But you do have to live with yourself down the road, and the decisions that you make. So I think it's something that people always have to be aware of and look for. And I think now that we're having more conversations, I don't think we even had ageism conversations years ago, right? Like it wasn't even in the public conscience. And now it's out there. So if you see it, you have to kind of speak out. But it does take some, I guess you have to know that you're going to get pushback if you speak out about any issue, right? So you have to be things that I'm stumbling a little bit, but here, just in general, issues that seem so out there 30 years ago seem the norm now. Right. So somebody, you need to start chipping away at issues. So I think if people see something, they should say something. And I think it involves both men and women because everybody gets older. But you're right. Like, I think men with, they can go gray and, it's distinguished and it's institutional knowledge. And then women are just old, and like they should dye their hair. So. Well,
Kristen, in my case, you can get bald too. So
there's that too,
not
right?
just gray. Although I got both of those going on at the same time. Well, your life is opened up in another way, a different way. You're a young, accomplished journalist. What are some of the routes for you next? What are you exploring? What do you see next for Kristen Shaughnessy?
Well, I have 4 former colleagues who have become very, very good friends, and we're actually writing a book. So we're shopping it right now. Hope to get a book deal. I'm probably saying more than I should, but it's the Irish community, so why not, right?
Absolutely. Is there anything we can, we know a lot of people in the book business, and
yeah, I mean, we're trying to help people, men and women, better navigate the workplace because the issues that we're discussing and other issues, just in terms of everything from finances, the things that you aren't taught to what you should know, to work-life balance, to I know that's kind of a tired term at this point, but just like life hacks. What helps you I'll give you a funny story. I had a friend who's like, you know what, I'm giving away my secret, but I just go and buy stuff at the store and then I put it in my own dishes and I bring it to somebody and I pretend I made it. She's like, I do it with my own family. They all think I'm a great cook, but she's like, I haven't made it. So yeah, just different things like that will help people. And also just what to look for. I was talking about documenting. I was talking about, there's times that people will just come into a toxic workplace generally, and they might have to just decide to leave because there's nothing illegal going on. But other times there might be illegal things. And then there's a big decision that has to be made. And that would be whether you call it out or you stay silent and move on from that.
Kristen, I told you we move to the end of the show. We get to the shameless plug. And it sounds like the book was maybe the beginning of a shameless plug, but is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience about or point them towards?
You know what? That's really it for now. We'll probably be starting like a group Facebook page at some point. We're talking about a podcast, and we like to do more speaking engagements about, workplace issues that people face. So if anybody's interested in having us speak, that could be one as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll include any kind of information. I love the podcast idea. We're happy to cross promote and, Martin and I have the idea of just like, our rising tide lifts all boats. So we're in touch with other Irish podcasters. We promote each other. We have each other on the show. So
yeah, there's room for everyone, right? Like there's room at the table for everyone. Well, I think you guys are doing a great job, and I'm sure it's as interesting. I think it's just the mix of guests you get are very interesting. So
it's been fun. It really has been fascinating.
Thank you for that, Kristen. And on behalf of John and me and our listeners, I really appreciate getting your insight into the news business and, also kind of pushing to the front of the conversation the issues surrounding ageism and sexism in the workplace. It's the work, probably, like you said, of a generation to kind of move that forward. So, people start thinking in those terms and being alert to it and making, and smacking it down when it emerges. And yeah, I totally agree with you. Look at the top of the corporation. Does it reflect the country or the city or the region that you live in? And if it doesn't, then you kind of need to be hyper aware of what's going on.
A friend of mine, Janine, who, has said often, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you have these conversations, that sort of becomes echoing in your mind.
We're glad to be a small part of it, Kristen, and help move the debate forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And you do great work. So
thank you.
And if we ever have a podcast, maybe you guys could come on ours.
Absolutely. Two elderly gentlemen.
We'd love it. We'd love it.
Well, John, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that conversation with Kristen.
Well, it was great to catch up with her. She's become a friend. In my career, I've done an awful lot of work with local TV, and she's one of the best. And Martin, we were talking just before we came on about how we would wrap things up, and the topic of ageism came up. And you said, John, you handle that one. So there's ageism right there. Already you're playing the ageism card on me, Martin. No, but it's a very important discussion, and Kristen highlights it very well. We often find ourselves in career paths where 35 now begins to seem too old. So there's a lot of great experience, wisdom, and knowledge, and Kristen helped us focus on that. But that wasn't the only thing we discussed.
Yeah, I think given the arena that Kristen operates in, you can't really talk about broadcast TV without talking about the issue of sexism as well. There is a double standard. We see certainly older men with gray hair like me treated as we're distinguished. However, younger women are told to color their hair. And so this double standard is deeply disturbing. And one hopes at some point that we can step away from that and begin to value our news people, not based purely on their veneer, but based on the knowledge that they bring to their reporting.
And I think, Mart, you heard some passion there from Kristen and that desire to tell stories and to put out the facts and let us decide on how we would interpret them. And I'm impressed. She's a professional. She kept at it day after day on her job professionally in a very difficult work environment. And I have to thank her. During the pandemic, she has kept up a great string of good news stories to inspire us in hard times on her Twitter feed. So congratulations to Kristen. And I appreciate the positive thoughts over these last few difficult years. To wrap this up, I'd like to appeal to the listeners. You can help us advance this global Irish nation conversation in a lot of ways, but one of the best ways is leave us a review.
Yeah, John, reviews are the lifeblood of podcasters. There's nothing like getting a nice 5-star review to warm the cockles of your heart. And specifically, I'm calling out to all you folks that are listening on your iPhones. You can get on to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review there. 57% of our listeners listen to the podcast on an iPhone. So you guys know who you are. And so please do us a favor. Get on to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.